What's good, everybody? It's your boy Dakota. I've just done so many takes of this video. You have no idea, but I'm just here to tell you thank you so much for supporting the show. If you like what I'm doing, subscribe to the channel, leave this video a little like, leave it a little comment. If you're an audio person, leave me a little 5 stars, maybe leave me a little review. Whatever you can manage, it all means a lot and it all helps. And go ahead and check out all the links I got in the description to support both myself and whoever the guest is this week. I always try to make sure that I leave links in the description so that you can follow the fighters once the show is debuted. And I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, welcome to episode 108 of the Slip and Weed podcast. I'm here with probably, if not my favorite commentator in the game right now, Corey Erdman. Corey, thank you so much for coming on today, bro.
Thanks so much for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be able to do this.
So let's start off. I've been enjoying your work on DAZN and on ESPN for the last couple of years now, but for me and for the rest of the fans, just give us a little introduction on who you are and a little bit about your boxing journey.
For sure. Yeah. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you know I'm a boxing commentator. And for the most part, at least in part, it's the only thing that I've ever done really for my entire adult life. I've more or less been calling fights since I was about 18 or 19 years old. I'm 36 now, so I've been calling fights for as long as I haven't in my in my waking years. Also I've been a writer for BoxingScene for sporting news for Vice over the years, but commentary has kind of been I guess the constant basically throughout my media career. One of the big ways that I got my start was through Sirius XM radio as well up here in Canada. I had a show with one of my best friends, Bomani Jones, for a long time. But all throughout all of those things and the different things that I've done, boxing has kind of always been at the core of it. And I'm someone who kind of grew up in and around the sport a little bit. My grandfather was best friends with Arnie Beam, who was Lennox Lewis's trainer up until a certain stage in his pro career in Kitchener, Ontario. So I think from an early age, I was kind of like rolling around the boxing ring and was familiar with boxing history. And I like to think I've carried that childlike wonder and passion for the sport into my adult years. So that's the Coles notes on who I am and how I got here.
Well, listen, man, you do so successfully. That's part of what I love about your commentary is I can hear that respect and that love for the sport in what you do. And I think that you do a great job, man. I really appreciate your work. So let's start with the card that you were just commentating. It was a great card. Give me your thoughts. And you're a Canadian as well, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So you've seen Mbilli a little bit, if I'm not mistaken. Give me your thoughts on Christian Mbilli because he's such an impressive guy. There's still a part of me where it's like the opponents are great, but they're not giving me an insight onto how he's going to look at the absolute top of the sport. So from your vantage point perspective, where do you see Christian Mbilli at in the mix at 168?
Yeah, I think he's as deserving as anyone for the big shot at Canelo, right? And one of the issues, we all love having undisputed champions, but then when it happens, you do get this logjam where every fighter is kind of waiting for that big opportunity, and the contenders aren't necessarily facing one another in the interim. And so I think it's true that Mbilli hasn't faced, the upper crust of the division. I would say probably his best opponent to date has probably been Carlos Gongora, right? Or maybe, there might have been some other fighters kind of that you could argue are kind of on that caliber. But I think that you could say the same for almost everyone that's waiting in line, with the exception of Benavidez and Plant, who faced one another. If we're talking about the other guys that are in line for Canelo, be it Berlanga or, his stablemate in Bazinian or Shishkin or all these other guys that are interesting and exciting, they're also untested. And I think that's just the reality of the landscape. The other reality for Mbilli and this sort of changes a little bit now that I the Tiger has a working relationship with Top Rank, is that he is with a little bit of a smaller promoter. Like I the Tiger is probably the biggest promoter in Canada right now, and they're running regular shows and they have an ESPN deal, but they don't have the size of bank account that say a full-fledged Top Rank would
Sure.
have, or a Matchroom or something like that. So when they're maneuvering in Billy, there's not always the budget there to get kind of a name brand opponent. And we saw that when they were moving Arslanbek Makhmudov up the rankings too, right? Other than Carlos Takam, you have to go to these kind of B and C tier heavyweights and hope that you can get what you otherwise would have out of the types of gatekeepers or faded contenders that would cost a little bit more. So I give Billy grace on those things, but as far as his in-ring performance, I mean, I think that Billy has number one, I think he's about as TV friendly as a fighter in the sport today, regardless of weight class. I think that he is just pure action and unadulterated violence in a way that I think even the most casual fan would appreciate. And I think that his performances, even against someone like a Mark Heffron, he's delivered a wow factor. I think that other fighters, his contemporaries that are waiting for that big shot at Canelo, arguably haven't quite had. So
Sure.
I've had a blast calling all of Billy's fights to this point, and to a degree, that is kind of the measuring stick. Have I had fun sitting down for every one of this guy's fights? Yes. Well, then I want to see him get big opportunities.
Well, and he is exciting, man. I can't think of pretty much every fight I've seen of his outside of the Gongora fight. He's just getting these explosive knockouts. He's clearly an exciting guy. The guy that he initially reminded me of was David Lemieux, where David was getting spectacular knockouts left and right. When he got up to a certain level, if it was Golovkin or whoever, Billy Joe Saunders, there was a certain IQ that he couldn't crack. I'm just excited to see. It seems like Billy might have that one more notch, and I think it'll be exciting to see how he fares at that next level. Is there like an obvious next opponent for him to kind of get in that mix?
Well, we know for a fact that he's going to be facing Sergey Derevyanchenko in August, which I think
Great
is, I
fight.
mean, that's a great step for him, right? I mean, I think that checks the boxes that people are looking to satisfy, right? You have Derevyanchenko, who, according to Ring Magazine, is still a top 10 guy in the division. He's there. He's battle tested. He's come damn close to beating both Munguia and Triple G. I think that's the appropriate next step. And it also gives him an opponent that he's going to continue to look exciting against. I mean, that for as long as that fight lasts, that's going to be an absolute banger. And I think that will probably, I don't know this to be true. I don't know where it's going to be. It might be in the United States, so it opens them up against you like another live viewing audience that is good for
Sure.
Billy in terms of spreading his brand, so to speak. So yeah, I think that's the perfect next step for Billy is already in line, and I think tomorrow there'll be an official press conference to announce it. So I think that he's already taking the right step.
That is a fantastic matchup. I actually wasn't aware that that was like a signed fight. I think the fight for me that I'm dying to see for him is him and Edgar Berlanga. That just feels like, two obvious undefeated punchers that are both very exciting. Somewhat, there's still unanswered questions. That seems like a fight that would be such a no-brainer as far as moving forward, but with 168. But like you said, the pros and cons of the undisputed champion is you got a large batch of guys kind of waiting for the same opportunity and not wanting to lose their standing within the division.
Exactly. And in the case of Berlanga, I mean, he does have that kind of trump card to get him a Canelo. I mean, he's already been in consideration for a Canelo fight, right? So if you're Berlanga, why would I want to fight this guy? I don't have to fight Christian Mbilli. And that's not to say that Berlanga as a human being, as a fighter, is afraid of another fighter, but it's probably not necessary for him. For Mbilli, he needs that Berlanga fight a lot more than Berlanga needs him.
Sure.
Berlanga, in all likelihood, could take some kind of interim fight and then just wait for Canelo to pick him because he does have that name value. There's the Mexico-Puerto Rico rivalry that, there's just these elements that on a promotional end are working in the favor of Berlanga that Mbilli doesn't have right now. Mbilli kind of has to create this groundswell of demand and create this highlight reel to the point where the fans say, we absolutely need to see this guy. And I think that if you compile his body of work to this point, and then if he can do the same thing against Derevyanchenko, because no one's been able to, like really bust up Derevyanchenko in
Yep.
that way. I mean, in some ways, it's the same blueprint as Jaime Munguia. People had all these doubts about, does Munguia actually deserve these opportunities? We were asking these same questions. Then he has a fight of the year against Derevyanchenko, and then people kind of cool off on that line of messaging. So I think that Mbilli is perfectly positioned to kind of satisfy all these things that people are asking for.
Well, and he's got that style where, especially in the modern internet era of boxing, he has those clippable moments that I think make
Yes.
him super marketable, for big name opponents. One other guy I wanted to bring up that was on that card was Arslanbek Makhmudov, big, strong heavyweight, tremendous puncher. What did you think of his performance, and where do you see him in the heavyweight landscape? I saw him in one way, and then we saw, I don't know if it was the second or the third round, he like started boxing in a much more technical way, and I was like, oh, there's the Olympian. I feel like we haven't seen this guy in the pros. What do you think of him as a contender at this moment?
Yeah, I think he's interesting stylistically because you're right. He does have that foundation where, when he's in the Mark Ramsey gym and he's working on the pads and he's sparring, he can tap into that a little bit. But I think that, the fun of Makhmudov, but maybe what will ultimately be his fatal flaw is that rawness. And I think that his default setting is just to be a big, overpowering brute. And that could be a lot of fun on TV. And I think that is where his mind goes to automatically in the ring. And so I don't know how much more of an evolution we're necessarily going to see out of Makhmudov. I think it's a question of, will he continue to get the big opportunities, and can his size and strength carry him through them? And there are lots of fun fight. I mean, any fight involving him against any name brand heavyweight or anyone anywhere close to the top 15 is going to be fun. The question is, will the Kaya Bell fight happen? Will we see that replay? Will he get clipped? Is he as durable as he needs to be? Those are all questions that remain to be seen. I think that when he steps up the next time against someone who's on a Kaya Bell type level, we'll get that answer. I mean, I'm willing to give him the grace that fighting with a broken hand had a big impact on what happened against Kaya Bell. But if we see the same result again, then we know that he's a fantastic power puncher with an Achilles heel. And we've
Yeah.
seen many of those throughout the years in the heavyweight division. And they could be fun too. We don't need to discard them immediately. They can hang around. They can have good days and bad days. Those high wire rack punchers make for great television, and that just may be who he is.
Well, and I think when I saw him at the last round of that fight, I think what I felt like was like, okay, there's more than meets the eye on this guy, maybe, or there's more tools in the bag than he's been letting on with his style of fighting. And I think that honestly, everyone was saying that Caballero was a given to beat Frank Sanchez, and I was like, listen, bro, this guy's pretty serious. If you've seen him against Makhmudov, you've seen him against Chisora, this kid's no joke. And I personally think just seeing that he's got a little something else in his tool bag, I feel like there's potential for him, especially since I think Caballero could legitimately be like a top 5 heavyweight right now.
Yeah, and in talking to Makhmudov, like he genuinely thinks and this doesn't mean that it's true, but in his mind, he really thinks that Kaya Bell fight was a fluke. Like when you ask him about it, he's basically he laughed and he's like, you think that guy's on my level? Like that shouldn't have happened. So he's already internalized that fight as being, like kind of a fluke. I don't think that loss is really dragging him down. And again, that doesn't mean that is reality. The same thing could happen in the rematch against Kaya Bell, but I think that it's a positive mindset for him to be in as he tries to get another big fight in Saudi Arabia.
Last thing I want to ask you about from the card that you were on, you guys did a great interview with Steve Claggett, who is
Mm.
ultimately going to be Tiafimo's next opponent. There's a quality in boxing that I think doesn't always get enough credit, and that's longevity. So just you pick up a couple losses, but you're able to keep winning and keep yourself relevant. I feel like he's such a prime example of that. But I haven't been able to see his last couple of fights. So do you view him as a legitimately viable opponent for Tio? And what is different in his last 8 or so fights? I don't know if I've seen him in the last at least 3 or 4. But what do you view as kind of like where's he taking it up to that next level?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd recommend going back and watching some of those last three because they're fun as hell. I mean, Steve Claggett, it seems like all the guys we're talking about here are kind of these made-for-TV guys, and Claggett really is that kind of guy. He's a hyper-aggressive, smothering volume puncher, and that's an interesting test, I think, for Teofimo. It could also be a great style for Teofimo as well. I think that Claggett I think he's deserving of this kind of fight. I know that he's not, one of those top 5 ranked guys. He's not on the, the dream matchmaking list for opponents for Teofimo, but that doesn't mean that he's not capable and deserving of getting in a position like this. If anything, this is a nice reward for exactly what you mentioned, a guy that built his career basically by himself in Western Canada with smaller promoters or just kind of managing his own career. Took a lot of early career losses, was the guy getting those late calls, racked up a whole bunch of losses and a record that, frankly, would just have you discounted. But both Eye of the Tiger and his new coach, Mike Maffa, saw something in him and they decided that, listen, this is a guy that we can rehabilitate. There's something more there. And really the difference with Claggett, and I think this is very instructive when we think about boxing overall, the difference for Claggett is resources. We like to think about boxing as this kind of meritocracy where everyone has the same ability to reach the same heights. The reality is the guy that has to work at Wawa and then go to train does not actually have the same they're not at the same starting block. They're at a different point on the track. And for Claggett, that's where he was. He was starting 400 meters behind and trying to catch up to these guys. And then you give him a promoter who says, you can just train full time. And you give him a trainer that is focused on him where he's priority A, and they actually think of him not as a guy, as an opponent that could maybe spring an upset and will take some short notice opportunities. We're going to treat you like an A side. We're going to build you up. We're going to give you fights to make you feel good. We're going to gradually build you up. We're going to get you a win against a Miguel Madueno and actually, nourish and take care of the fighter that way. That's the difference. I think that it is clear that Claggett always had these capabilities, but most fighters that enter the sport don't get the opportunity that the fighters that we generally see on television have. And that's because the guys that we see typically had a nice amateur background and they had something when they turned pro that compelled someone to give them money and time and resources to actually build and grow. And Claggett didn't have that opportunity, but when he did, he turned himself into a genuine contender. So I think overall, whether Steve winds up winning that fight or not, I think it's a great blueprint to show fighters and promoters and everyone in the business that, when you see a fighter with a bunch of losses, but they're talented, hey, maybe they can be a real rehabilitation project. Maybe they just don't have to be the guy that has a decent looking record that we can get wins against. What about trying to rehab that guy? And I'm glad that Claggett, because he's, one of the nicest boxers you're ever going to meet. I'm glad that he's the one that got the opportunity to do that.
And listen, bro, not for nothing. There's a lot of big names at that weight, and it kind of feels like Teo has not had his best performances since the Lomachenko fight. Obviously, the Josh Taylor fight was tremendous, but the Sandor Martin fight, the Jermaine Ortiz fight, there's been multiple, and Kambosos being the most obvious, but there's been multiple performances where he just hasn't looked his best. I'm sure in their mind they view this as dialing it back. But for Steve, it's kind of like, it's the biggest opportunity of his career and probably the most prepared that he's ever been for that opportunity.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, all the resources possible are going to be going into this one. I know he's got Christopher Guerrero, who's going to be in camp with him, will be one of his chief sparring partners who can, do a good Teofimo dupe in sparring for him. And yeah, and listen, we see this scenario where, to your point, I think that Lopez and his camp think of this as, yeah, a little bit of a step back. They've probably scouted this as being a favorable style matchup for him. But for Claggett, this is his Super Bowl. This is the fight that he's always dreamt of. And sometimes when you get fighters who are on that wavelength, you go back to Teofimo versus Kambosos, and not to relive that night, but it's a similar type of disparity in mentality coming into the fight. And if you're Claggett, you hope to be able to capitalize on that.
I know you were on the clock, but briefly, just give me your thoughts on Jack Catterall finally getting to get a rematch with Josh Taylor and get the decision that he already deserved.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, people feel good for Catterall getting that win. You know, they justifiably felt like he won that fight the first time around. This one was even more fun than the first time around, and now Taylor feels like there's a little bit of injustice there. So for Catterall now, I think he was stuck in that position where he should have had that win over Josh Taylor the first time. So those big fights should have been on the table for him for the last year and a half. Now they actually can be. And, you know, I'm sure that he's going to have his eye on the winner of Matias Pero coming up in June. And I mean, that would be a tremendous fight if he could, whoever wins that fight. But let's say it's Matias versus Catterall. I mean, that's a fight of the year contender on paper. So Catterall is now looking at some big opportunities. But for Taylor, I think the fact that his promoter is so vehemently backing him when it comes to those scorecards means he'll probably get another big opportunity as well. Of course, he's going to move down in the rankings and his chances won't be as big as Catterall's, but Taylor doesn't get moved immediately to the scrap heap, I think, after that fight either.
It was funny because the first one I actually scored a little bit closer than this one, but I also felt like it was a more competitive fight. Like we talk about competitive fights are not necessarily close fights, right? Because you could have a bunch of close rounds, but one guy's just getting the edge. It felt like this was Taylor's best performance, honestly, in his last three fights. And it was the first time where I was like, all right, maybe he moves up in weight. Maybe there's some things change. Maybe there's something there. Catterall, I think, just has his number too. But to see Taylor go from this, very dominant champion in his era to kind of struggling physically, it is kind of tough to watch.
Yeah, and I mean, realistically, like most champion level fighters, like what do they actually have? They have like 3 or 4 great nights at the championship level, right? If you have more than that, you're probably in the Hall of Fame. And if what
Yeah.
Josh Taylor turns out to be is a great champion in his day who is just beneath Hall of Fame level, that's a hell of a career, right? And that's just how most top level careers go as well. I mean, if you're playing the odds, that's probably the case when it comes to Josh Taylor.
All right, so we've been off the air for a couple of weeks. Haven't gotten to talk about the big undisputed fight of heavyweights between Alexander Usyk and Tyson Fury, one of the most significant fights in years, obviously the most significant heavyweight fight of the last 25 years. Incredible performance by Usyk, a great performance from Fury as well. What were some of your initial takeaways from that fight?
Yeah, I mean, when I was watching it, my reaction as I was watching it was like, wow, this is mesmerizingly high level boxing. Like lost in, all of the drama that was around this fight and everyone, wanting to play armchair psychologist when it comes to Tyson Fury and everyone's predictions and whatnot. These are two damn good boxers, and watching them jostling with one another and the all the games that are going on with the footwork and the feints and whatnot, that was such high level complex boxing. That was my takeaway from it. I thought that Usyk deserved the decision, but at the same time, I didn't walk away from that fight with less of an opinion of Tyson Fury. I think that Fury is a guy who is a magnificent boxer who ran into the one guy in the heavyweight division that he can't outbox. And maybe if you're going back and you're trying to retool a game plan for Fury, maybe you find a way to be a little bit more physical, but that's not how he treated this. He tried to outbox Alexander Usyk and he ran into the ultimate chess master. The other takeaway I had, I'm going to tiptoe a little bit here because I know Sugar Hill and we've worked together as commentators as well. I did feel like ultimately maybe one of the issues for Fury, and this happens, is that one thing that corners are tasked with is accurately scoring the fight on the fly. And I think that Fury's corner they weren't scoring it well, or maybe more specifically, John Fury wasn't scoring it well, because I think that Shug was giving Fury very specific technical advice. He wanted him to plant his feet and he wanted to throw a check hook. He thought he could hurt Usyk if he could start leaning into that. It was clear that Tyson's father thought that he was ahead on the scorecards. And so the messaging to Fury It was, okay, we want you to make these technical adjustments because we want you to be able to hurt him, not because you need to be able to hurt him. And so what
Sure.
that created was a little bit of a lack of urgency when maybe he needed it at times in that fight. And that was, it's just it was a fault in judgment on his corner's part that they didn't tell him, man, you need to win rounds. And if you're behind right now, so you're gonna need to hurt him. Not that it would be nice if you knocked him out. And so just a little twisted messaging might have made a difference to Fury in that fight. It might not, because Alexander Usyk is obviously, one of the best fighters that we've seen in this era, and if not the best fighter on the planet today.
And there's no way to talk your way out of getting dropped and getting legitimately buzzed. I mean, there
Yes,
was,
that too.
there was what, 3, 4 knockdowns scored there where he's hitting the ropes and the ref's not calling it, and then he hits the ropes and the ref's not calling it. Then on the third or fourth time he finally calls it. Like, there's no way to get around that. I've seen a few people whose like opinions in boxing that I trust that think that Fury won that fight, and I just can't see more than 4 or 5 rounds you could give him. But the amazing thing was how well Usyk started, touching him to the body, like you said, all the drop feints and everything. And then Fury makes this incredible adjustment, and he's boxing, he's using his jab, he's hurting Usyk to the body. And then Usyk, like Crawford, like Inoue, a lot of the greats, Canelo, he's just got that next level that he can go to when you're gas tank is starting to run low. He's actually got this whole other reserve where now I'm going to separate myself. And we've seen him do that in multiple fights he's having trouble with. If it's the Bellew fight, if it's the second Joshua fight, we've seen him overcome those things. And I think that that's really what makes him such a special fighter in this moment. And also, that he's the size that he is, having these performances against guys that are so much bigger. It's, for me, it's hard to argue that he's not an all-time great heavyweight, but I still see so many fans saying, "Oh, you can't put him in with the Alis and the Foremans and the Fraziers." And on one hand, I respect that opinion. On the other, those guys didn't have to fight guys that were 6'9", 280. And so I just think that there's like kind of a lack of context there, where his heavyweight career is incredibly short, but 3 of those are against the other 2 best guys. And from my perspective, he's beating them clearly.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. I think that one thing, just to build upon your point, one thing that is really impressive to me about Usyk in the ring, and it's kind of hard to describe this without being like too heavy-handed, but he's a master of snatching back momentum. And what
Yeah.
I mean by that is there were rounds even in that fight where Fury won the round, but say in the final 20 seconds of that round or so, it wasn't enough to win the fight, but he did something so that when Fury came out the next round, in his heart, he probably felt like, oh shit, I have to make an adjustment now. Like Usyk never lets a fight get fully out of his control. And part of that is having so many tools that you can try different things. And for him, that meant that Fury, there was never a period in the fight where you felt like Fury was going to run away with this. Even when he was hurting him to the body and whatnot, Usyk was always doing something that made Fury have to make an adjustment. When it comes to where we assess Usyk in the all-time list, like, listen, I understand, like, are you going to rank, when people say he's not an all-time heavyweight, I guess we have to quantify, like, what does that mean? Like, would I rank him ahead of Muhammad Ali right now? No. But are you going to make him like a top 20 heavyweight of all time? Like, why not? He's the best heavyweight of this era, seemingly. And he's done so in such an impressive fashion, and has done so by fighting from underneath, size-wise, coming up from cruiserweight. Why not? I think that when we're saying that, like, let's quantify exactly what does all-time great mean. Are we talking top 5? Are we talking top 10, top 20? Ultimately, all you can really say is Usyk will go down as the guy who cleaned out this division in his era. And that's all that he can achieve. He can't go back in time and fight George Foreman. He can't do any of those things. And also, when we're grading fighters and how great they are overall, sometimes you need a little bit of time and space for that context to fully flesh out, for us to consider when
Totally.
looking back how great some of these fighters are. We're even seeing that, I think, now with, like, people are having a new appreciation for fighters from the early 2000s and fighters from the 90s, like we're
Absolutely.
having people kind of relitigating like how great Oscar was. People think, people like to joke about Oscar in these different ways, but I've seen over the last couple of years within boxing circles, people are like, that fucker fought everyone,
Yeah.
like that. So I think that sometimes you just need time to fully consider how great these people are in the moment.
Hey, listen, I was actually talking about this with my friend the other night, but when I was a teenager, Bert Sugar had put out a book called The Top 100 Boxers of All Time. And I remember reading through that, and all the guys from his era were in the front, and then all the guys from my era were in the back. And trying to contextualize, like, okay, you have Barney Ross, whatever, number 7, but you have Roy Jones, number 88. And I can't figure out how you think that's true. But I think that you're right. Some time does have to go by for people to really see the entirety of the body of work to really appreciate, what it is that they've accomplished. Um, for me, I never try to go, oh, he's the number one guy, he's the best guy. I make the point that he's now got a seat at the table. And if you can't give him a seat at the table, I just think you're not enjoying, what is otherwise a great heavyweight. And by the way, Tyson Fury has a seat at that same table, at least as far as I'm
Sure.
concerned.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Like and there's boxing does this in a way that other sports like don't do quite as much. We do see it, we see it in basketball. We see it less so in baseball, but I think basketball is a good comparison where we're always sort of like pointing back to a prior generation and we're robbing ourselves of the joy of the present generation, right? And like just allow yourself to appreciate what you're seeing rather than say, wow, this guy couldn't like couldn't beat Jack Dempsey or what. Like we don't know that. And also again, like going back to what we're talking about, like we're not able to put the context of this generation together. And the other point you made was a good one too, about like who is the teller of history. And right now it's kind of our generation now that gets to be the sort of authorities on these rankings and these lists. And you compare it to, how we talk about music, for example, right? Like Apple Music just put out their 100 greatest albums of all time the other day, and people are debating that online. And ultimately, the cast of characters putting that together are different from the ones that put Rolling Stones list together a couple of years ago. They're younger, and so you'll see stuff like a Frank Ocean album in the top 10 and whatnot. And like, so we're seeing kind of what has resonated with this generation is going to be different from, what Bert Sugar saw and who he thinks is the greatest. And they all belong at that table. And if we want to have a fun discussion about who would beat who or whose body of work is better, I think all that is fair. But I think you should, just for your own enjoyment of the sport, in your words, allow these people to sit at the table too.
What we got this weekend is Zhilei Zhang and Deontay Wilder. This is a very interesting matchup, but it is two older guys that are coming off of a loss. It is on a pay-per-view. I'm not sure how to feel about that, but how do you assess this fight, and even how do you assess the significance of this fight?
I think that this is kind of the last chance hotel for Wilder. I think that the esteem around Wilder is so low right now that he needs a win here. And frankly, if he doesn't beat Zhang, and this is no disrespect to Wilder, but I think that he has to think about like what is there left for him to achieve then if he can't beat
Yeah.
Zhang at this stage in his career. For Zhang, this would be kind of a career revitalization and, the probably the buzziest win of his career, right? Obviously, those Joyce wins were fantastic, but beating Wilder comes with a different kind of cachet. It's going to be a fascinating fight. It's not going to be a fast-paced fight. Ultimately, this is an orthodox fighter and a southpaw who both don't throw a lot of punches, but they have an eraser of a backhand. Right?
It might be the two best punchers.
Might be the two best punchers in the division, might be the two best straight power shots in the division, maybe in boxing, in terms of the effect that they can have. And that's what it's gonna be. And that, like, I always say there's different ways for fights to be very exciting. There's just like what we think of as this kind of the model of the fight of the year where it's chest to chest, forehead to forehead, volume punching extravaganza. There's like big momentum swing type exciting fights and fights of the year. And there's fights like this where you just get two punchers and you kind of have this anxiety throughout the fight, right?
Yeah.
Where both these guys are a little bit vulnerable and they're ultra powerful. And this is going to be that kind of feeling throughout the fight. Your heart's going to be racing, like, what's going to happen? When is it going to happen? And that to me is really, really compelling.
It is a really interesting fight, and like you said, while it's happening, it might be a little bit of a snooze while we're waiting for the big punch from whoever that may be. It's so tough to know, after a performance like Wilder has against Parker, where he just doesn't let his hands go for 12 rounds, and it basically lets a shorter guy kind of walk him down and pick him apart, not even necessarily beat him up, but just really out tactic him. It's tough to know, and that's been the beauty of Deontay, right? Is he'll be losing the whole fight and then it's over because he lands that bomb. It would seem that he'll always be capable of that. I just wonder if he'll still do it at this age and at this level. Whereas for Zhang, I see him as a more fluid, athletic puncher, but whether or not he can sustain it or do it at a volume where he's getting above 40 punches around is probably unlikely. But it does kind of feel like whoever lands clean first, right? I mean,
Yeah, exactly. And I think that Zhang realistically is about like a 20 to 25 punch per round type guy,
yeah,
tops.
that was
There are rounds where he
generous. Yeah, that
throws
was
fewer than
generous.
those, right? So I think the difference here for Deontay is that, luckily for him, he doesn't have Parker in front of him who, if you look at kind of the pool of guys that aren't heavyweight champion right now or that aren't Alexander Usyk, he might be the best kind of disarmor of the guys in there, in that, like, Parker is a good mover, he has great legs, and he can quiet these rounds down and he can take your tools away. Zhang's just kind of going to be in front of you. He might take them away through the threat of that lead hand or the short right hook if he can get close enough to you, which I don't really think is going to be a factor in this fight, unless like kind of in a clinch or something like that. This is just going to be two guys in front of one another, and whoever wants to lead the dance might just be the guy that wins this fight. That might be what this fight comes down to.
On this card, we were going to have Bivol and Beterbiev. That unfortunately is no longer happening because Beterbiev has his annual injury. That's not a slight at him. He's literally one of my favorite fighters, but it does kind of feel like it happens right when he's about to have the big one. For me, in light of that, the most exciting matchup is Daniel Dubois and Filip Hrgovic, where it feels like the winner of that fight does become a real player at heavyweight. How do you see that one playing out?
That's a fascinating fight too. I think that, if you're looking at kind of whose stock is higher right now, I oddly think it's kind of Daniel Dubois. I think that there has been this kind of, for a while, Hrgovic was kind of in that he was kind of regarded the way that Makhmudov was for a little while. He was like the guy who didn't win the Olympic gold medal that everyone rallied behind and said, this is the dangerous guy. This is the guy. Oh, he hurt Joshua in sparring. He's going to be the one that rises above. And I don't think that Hrgovic has really ever given his supporters from that era the evidence to really support what they were saying, right? He hasn't given them that performance where people are like, yeah, see, like that's the one. Dubois, I think, is kind of, after sort of being written off after the Joyce fight, I think he's kind of exceeded expectations a little bit. I think that he had a decent performance against Usyk, all things considered. And I don't know, man. I think that it's good that we're getting clarity as far as like who is actually that next tier, who is actually in line. And I don't have a read on necessarily who I think is going to win this fight, but kudos to both guys for wanting to take that step. And Hrgovic has kind of been in that like wait and see holding pattern for a little while. And I think that we're going to get the answers that we need about him in this fight.
And you got to give it up to Dubois for consistently taking just the toughest opposition
Oh yeah.
available to him. You read down his resume in the last couple of years, ending it with a knockout win over Jarrell Miller. I mean, he's been on an incredible run where the wins and losses column doesn't tell the whole story.
No, and by the way, like, he deserves an apology from anyone who after that Joyce fight was calling him like a quitter or didn't have the heart for the sport. First of all, don't fight through a broken orbital bone if you don't want to. I don't care. You don't owe that to me. But he clearly wanted to. But obviously, this is a fighter with a fighter's heart. And the people who are saying that about him in the moment, like looking at what he's done that you just outlined, like, Dubois deserves an apology from those people who were talking about him back then.
Hey, anybody sitting on a couch talking about a guy doesn't want to fight with a broken eye socket, I don't know what to tell you, bub.
Yeah, you don't want to fight at all, and justifiably, like, people shouldn't want to do this. It's not normal.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, One other thing I want to ask you about real quick. We see potentially Fundora and Errol Spence set for October. We don't have an exact date on that. How do you feel about that fight? Because I feel a little conflicted. Not that I don't think it's a good matchup, just that there's so many good guys at 154. You see a big name at welterweight moving up, but he's coming off a completely devastating loss. How do you feel about this fight in general?
Yeah, I'm just like I have conflicting emotions because on one side, I'm happy for Fundora, who, after getting knocked out, it looked like there was no path to this kind of a fight for him. Like it just looked like, okay, he's sort of, I hate using this word, I hate using the word exposed, but that I'm putting that in the mouths of what people would be saying about him. And it just didn't look like he was going to have that a path to something like this. Then you get the win over Tim Tszyu, and suddenly he's maybe main eventing at Cowboy Stadium against Errol Spence. Like, I'm happy for Fundora, who monetarily, this is obviously the biggest opportunity
Yeah, it
for
is a
him.
sick story.
It's right, like,
Yeah.
and for him, if you lay out all of his options, even if we want other sort of options, like for him, he's going to make the most money and be in the biggest fight for him. So he's going to choose this. For Errol, it's just like it's hard not to look back at the Crawford fight and knowing what he's been through with the car crash and everything, and not like, I just feel a little bit uncomfortable about Errol right now. And that's not me telling Errol Spence to retire or anything like that, but there's just like there's a little bit of unease when it comes to watching Errol Spence right now. And maybe he wins this fight, and maybe he has this big bounce back. Maybe the weight was the driving factor of what happened against Crawford. Although, like, I suspect that at any weight that fight would probably wind up looking roughly the same. But now that he doesn't have to kill himself to make weight, does he look a little bit fresher? I don't know. And also, he's kind of floated the idea that maybe he won't be around for that long. So maybe for him, it's, I want one last hurrah to win a world title on my way out at Cowboy Stadium, and this is my swan song. And if that's what he wants, good for him. I mean, what a story to fight this giant of a man and win a 154-pound world title, and pose at the 50-yard line or whatever. What a way to end it, right? Yeah, I think that Spence is probably going to be the betting favorite, I would imagine, in this one, but that doesn't mean that I have a read on who's going to win this fight or how I feel fully. It's just I'm
Well,
a
it
little
was so
conflicted.
interesting to see
Yeah.
Fundora completely change up his tactics against Tim Tszyu,
Mhm.
where I've been dying for him to use a jab and use his height. We've all been saying, like, bro, you have those abilities and those tools, please use them. And then he gets stopped by Mendoza, and we go, all right, he's either going to learn now or this is just what he is. And it turns out he did learn that lesson and fought a completely different fight against Tszyu in spite of the cuts and the bleeding for both of them. I think that tactical shift was a big part of why he won that fight. For Errol, I think that discomfort that you're talking about, I've actually been feeling it for a while in his speech pattern. And that's not a slight on him, right? That's a genuine concern as a fan, as where it's like I see interviews of him before the accident and after the accident, and there's no doubt there's a different rhythm to how he speaks. Now, when he goes out and dominates Danny Garcia, all of that goes away. But when he has a performance that we see maybe some of those physical limitations of his experiences or whatever, however you perceive that fight, it is a little uncomfortable because he is a tremendous fighter. And I think those things have become unavoidable now that he's taken a beating.
Yeah, it's kind of like, oh man, it's like when Meldrick Taylor moved up, right? Like
Yeah.
we've seen him, like, kind of like we get these senses of erosion, and he's tapped out at lighter weight classes, and then suddenly he's at 54, and you're like, this is a little, or like Terry Norris when he started kind of moving up too. You get this, like, you remember the brilliance, and then you're starting to see that kind of deterioration, and as a fan, it could be a little bit uncomfortable. That said, there are examples of guys who just, like, they run into an elite fighter like he did against Terrence Crawford, but then have success afterwards. It's just like there's that other element of everything we know about, like, what he's gone through and what we've seen visually that he's gone through in the ring just makes it a little tough to get like really jacked up about this fight. But obviously, I want to be happy for both guys, because in a different way, like I'm happy that they get this moment, but I want it to be for the right reasons, in bachelor speak.
Last topic I got for you, Corey, and it's one that I've to some extent intentionally avoided because I don't love giving Ryan Garcia attention for certain types of extracurriculars, we'll call them. But it's unavoidable. He's just gotten a spectacular win against Devin Haney, and then we have Vada comes up with two positive tests for him for a drug called Osterine. What is your take on this situation? And I guess on drug testing as a whole in boxing, where we don't have a uniform policy, some places are stricter than others. I think UCOD does a great job sort of working across the board in the UK. It just seems like if you're going to take a test and fail it as an athlete and as an athlete of that caliber, on some level, you have to be accountable for it, whether the fight's changed to a no contest or Haney's now entitled to a rematch. But what are your thoughts on this situation? Because it is a complicated one, it seems like.
Yeah, so drug testing in boxing in general, I mean, it's very clear that we have a very, very imperfect setup in the sport when there's drug testing at all. But in this case, which is in terms of what's available to us in the sport, seemingly the highest level of drug testing we have, it still is an unavoidable fact that you could take kind of whatever you want, as long as you don't piss hot ahead of the fight, you can fight dirty. And so having this test and then for it to retroactively come out, well, I mean, the danger to your opponent is still, that's already like the damage has already been done. Right. And I, just me to you as we're doing a podcast right here, I don't have the answer to that at the top of my mind, but I do know that this is a lot different than retroactively changing the results of a race at the Olympics. And that setup sucks too, but at least, the sprinter that is getting bumped up from silver to gold wasn't physically imperiled. So now when it comes to Ryan and his tests, I'm going off of kind of what I've read and I've learned from, experts online when it comes to drug testing. There's a YouTube channel called More Plates, More Dates. And
he's fantastic, the host of that channel.
Yeah,
he's
right.
Fantastic.
So, Derek obviously is an expert in this field. And looking at what he's studied when it comes to this, I think this is just my opinion, and it's very much rooted in what he thinks, and I thought this beforehand. It's most likely that Ryan and whoever was working with him wasn't just straight up taking Osterine before this fight. Like, I think that it is so, and we're splitting hairs when it comes to intent here, I guess. But I think that there's a slight difference between Ryan just taking Osterine and knowing that it's illegal and going for it. I think more likely what happened here is he was taking a supplement that was not NSF certified and had some sort of contamination. Now, that is also a problem, right? If you are an athlete who is high level and you're getting tested, it is your responsibility. People, and it's become a cliche, like, oh, you're responsible for what goes into your body. More specifically, you are responsible for getting supplements that have been tested and are not contaminated, because you're gonna test dirty. I don't know whether the levels of Osterine in his body actually helped him against Devin Haney. I don't know, but I do know that he's responsible for not having that in his body. And he was probably taking a pre-workout or, the mushroom tablet or something that had Osterine in it. And it got to, and seemingly taken quite a bit of it to get to the levels that he was at. They weren't the levels of Osterine that you would take if you were trying to like dope for a bodybuilding competition, but there were enough of them that he was clearly taking a lot of a supplement that was not NSF certified. That's his fault, right? And he's just going to have to own that. And but the problem is we get to a really dangerous place if we start arguing, well, that amount didn't actually make a difference. Sure. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that gets us into very dangerous territory where we're like, oh, you could dope a little bit, but not this much. If we want a clean sport, then you aim for a clean sport. And that means is like, you gotta look at the labels of what you're taking.
Yeah. And I just think it's important that, and I don't know exactly who it would be, if it's the athletic commission, if it's the sanctioning bodies, whoever that would be, to take a stand on this one in one way or another, because I just think the last couple of big names that have popped, if it's Conor Benn, if it's Alicia Baumgardner, it just seems like the solution is to disappear for a little bit. And I just think that gray area doesn't help boxing to kind of deter people, from doing that. Because if you're making big checks, it's like, all right, I'll take my year off and I'll come back and people will have forgotten.
Yeah, and I just like there's a dangerous pattern with kind of everything that's happened with Ryan here, whether it's how he was behaving ahead of the fight and the things that he was saying. We're like, oh, okay, all that's cool because it's just promotion. Then he blows weight, and we're like, oh, well, that's cool. It was just a great tactical move. Well, he has Austrian in his system, yeah, but it's not all that much. Like, what is truth at this point, and what is acceptable? If we can just sort of like spin anything that, like, we're getting into very dangerous territory in boxing then, where you can just say and do anything, and provided you win or you're popular enough, it's cool. Like, I
Or
don't
if you
know
just go, hey, I'm just breaking your balls. Like, okay, that was
just breaking your balls. It's all cool. Like, which doesn't seem to be the case when it comes to Ryan, because he's behaving the very same way after the fight. Like, what are we doing here? And I don't know that is an environment that I really want to foster in this sport. It seems like one more turn and we're in very dangerous territory.
Corey, this has been a tremendous episode. When and where will people get to see you on the air next?
Yeah, man. This Friday, you can watch me on Overtime Boxing. We're going to be in Houston. We got the 154-pound tournament going on there, so you can catch me there. And then the next night in Niagara Falls, Lucas Body is going to be fighting on DAZN. So back-to-back shows for me here, and you can catch some of my writing these days. I'm actually doing a little bit of writing about bare knuckle. So I've got a website that I'm kind of consulting for and writing for called Bare Knuckle Nation. It's bareknucklenation.com. So for those of you out there who are enjoying the bare knuckle game, or trying to give some regular coverage to it, and to trying to fill a little bit of a niche that isn't there. And for me, I'm enjoying getting to tell stories of new people that I'm not always around, and some fighters that don't necessarily get any coverage at all in a lot of cases. For me, just it's kind of a creative passion project. So if people want to check that out, I'm over there as well.
You can really see the bare knuckle game developing too. I got a buddy, Harry Gigliotti, who's a decent, regional level fighter, who's switched over to bare knuckle and's having, tremendous success, where the skill set he brings to boxing is so valuable in that sport. I guess real quick, just how do people watch bare knuckle?
So, I mean, there are two main companies right now. One is BKFC and one is BYB, where Harry Gigliotti fights. And BKFC is on Triller Plus, or it has its own app. It's like $7 a month, and they have a show every week, sometimes two. Like, their schedule is absolutely wild. And the shows are like, they're always entertaining. They're always fun. You'll see some fighters that you recognize come through. Guillermo Rigondeaux is going to fight in BKFC.
Whoa.
Derek Findlay is fighting this weekend.
That's crazy.
Right. There are guys that come through, and then on the BYB end, they've got a TV deal with beIN Sport. They just acquired BKB, the main bare knuckle outfit in the UK. So there's just a big collection of talent going on right now that is growing and growing. And as you mentioned, it's a nice place for guys for men and women that are, in a lot of cases, like regional level fighters in gloved boxing, can move over, and suddenly you're fighting on these big productions on pay-per-view, and maybe you're winning a world title. Like Austin Trout is the welterweight champion in BKFC right now. Right. So it's also a place where fighters who are kind of at the end of maybe their marketability in the gloved game could bounce over and have a total career revival. It's just a lot of fun, and there are a lot of great stories to be told. And, is provided you're okay with the visual brutality of it, I would say just tune into a fight, have your friends over. It's never boring. Like, you're going to have a good time watching these shows.
It's been such a pleasure having you on, man. Is there anyone, anything, anywhere you want to shout out before we wrap this up?
Oh, man, I'm trying to think of who I want to shout out. Listen, watch more boxing, support the fighters, be kind to the fighters, be kind to one another, and appreciate greatness like Usyk and like Canelo while we have it. And don't spoil your time arguing about whether or not, they would beat Sam Langford. Just enjoy the fights, because there are a lot of them, and there's a lot of good action every weekend to occupy you, and not fight on the internet. Just enjoy what we're seeing.
Love the Sam Langford pull. Corey Erdman, everybody. Appreciate you, brother. Thanks for coming on.
Take care, man.